Good morning, colleagues. Molweni mawethu. Sivukile sonke. Diyabona. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, this is our start for today, day 2 of our ALASA conference. The first speaker, we're going to get a message of support from PanSALB CEO, Mr. Lance Schulz. Tata, over to you.
Program Director, good morning. Delegates, the DVC, Professor Mkhize, Chairperson of ALASA, Dr. Malete, all of the keynote speakers, and I wish to point them out to you as well. For the day, Professor Maseko from the Nelson Mandela University, Professor Makalela from WITS, Professor Omari from the University of Dar es Salaam, Professor Ma from the Beijing Foreign Studies University, Dr. Ndebele from the University of the Free State, Professor Shlongwa, the new chairperson of COPOL, and we're looking very forward to working with COPOL as well. Professor Loli Makubu Bardenos, the deputy chairperson of COPOL, Professor Khala, the chairperson of the South African Language Practitioners Council, Dr. Cynthia Kamalo, the acting DG in the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture. She is in absentia. The sponsors, Mr. Madondo, Shooter and Shooter via Africa. I also need to make mention of the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. I did see our professor here earlier on. I don't see him here at the moment, but you are recognized. The members of the media that are here in attendance as well, importantly, distinguished guests and all protocols observed. It is with immense pleasure that we as the Pan-South African Language Board participate and have partnered with ALASA on this year's conference, something no different than what we have done in years before, which is being hosted by the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and we thank the university for availing their resources and also for having us here as the host. This also is testament to our collective commitment to the advancement of African indigenous languages in terms of Section 2, subsection 2 of the Constitution, as well as the PanSALB Act. The conference theme, in focusing on reimagining the role of African languages for social justice and transformation in the digital age, is now more crucial than ever. In having listened to a number of the papers being presented yesterday, I can indeed say, Program Director, that this theme has resonated. One of the laments that I have of probably conference fatigue that I suffer having to attend very many of these is that a lot of these conferences have got a lot of engaging papers. But what's critical for me is to have key resolutions coming out from those conferences so that in terms of our social compacting, we can actually go and implement. And if the conference is held as part of a continuous program of action, at least when we get back to the second iteration, we can report back on that. I'm hoping, Program Director, that this conference will indeed seek to do that. Keep us to the test so that we as PanSALB can also report back on the progress as these resolutions are formulated. In a rapidly changing world where the digital landscape influences every aspect of our lives, it is imperative that we explore innovative ideas to advance the development of African languages. 4R has in fact been here already. In fact, 5R is being spoken about at the moment. Africa, with the third industrial revolution, was referred to as Luddites because they were behind the curve. There was slow adoption of practices in terms of what it presented, and the microchip had created huge advances through the global north, but the south had really suffered and lamented with it. As one of the things that's being opened up now in South Africa, which is spectrum, broadband, there's going to be much more opportunity for connectivity. Here's an opportunity to give access to our languages, and in particularly those that need the type of information that the digital age will provide to them so that they can indeed have access to resources. In the early 1990s, Neville Alexander asked a critical question of whether it is possible for us to turn the languages we speak in South Africa into a resource instead of allowing them to remain a problem. This gathering of the minds is particularly key in answering this question. The significance in this conference lies in the ability to bring together experts from different schools of thought to exchange ideas, identify critical issues, and find innovative ways to address the challenges hindering the use and the development of African languages. I heard one or two of the speakers speak about Swahili and the reach and what is the program of action around it. It is in fact in our hands. We need to ensure that we become inclusive as part of our programs of decoloniality. And I think the universities are going to be playing a critical role in terms of the advancement of Swahili in the face of other languages such as Mandarin that is making a profound presence, particularly in Middle Africa. As PanSALB also, we are engaging critical institutions to encourage more research in indigenous languages. Through this collaboration, we hope to bring together other like-minded institutions to craft a national research strategy focusing on indigenous languages. Our time is now. This we can only achieve through strengthening our existing relationships and forging new partnerships to achieve shared strategic objectives. We also want to encourage universities to seek out opportunities to collaborate with organizations that can support their works in higher registers such as research, science, business, as well as mathematics. We must leverage synergies and maximize collaborative opportunities, as well as share resources and avoid duplication, particularly in the areas of terminologies and glossary development. It's prudent for universities to realize that their collaboration in language policy and terminology development is not by choice, but it is prescribed in terms of Clause 38 of the Language Policy Framework for Public Higher Education Institutions. We are going to be seeking much more collaboration with the university ecosystem to ensure that these glossaries and terminology development is provided to us and that we can create a repository that this can have ease of access across the spectrum of the users and beneficiaries. PanSALB is resolute in its position in that the development of indigenous African languages is only possible through active use. Therefore, it is important to foster multilingualism, to respect and provide for all official languages, and to promote respect and recognition for previously marginalized languages. Our continued investment in advancing the discourse on the development and use of African languages help us dispel the notion that indigenous languages cannot be used for purposes of trade, business, or to be used in higher registers. It is our collective responsibility to promote for the awareness and the principle of multilingualism as a national resource and which is espoused as a central tenet in the work that we as PanSALB are doing. As PanSALB, through our partnership with ALASA, we hope to strengthen our role in initiating studies and research aimed at promoting respect for all our languages for the enjoyment and parity of esteem. I am confident that the discussions held during this conference will pave the way for considerable progress in the development and use of African languages. Let us embrace the opportunity to collaborate, innovate, and inspire each other as we work towards the common goal of promoting the richness in the tapestry of our African languages. Lastly, do not be afraid of critically scrutinizing PanSALB and our latest efforts to deliver on our mandate, including being critical on the mandate itself, as we, seen as the insiders, may not be able to be objective of certain provisions, executions, and deliverables. And for this, we open ourselves up to you indeed for scrutiny and for active engagement. Program Director, I wish to thank you and I look forward to engaging in meaningful and productive discussions, including progressive propositions in what the new PanSALB board can do in the next 5 years. I'm certainly looking very forward to our new board coming in sooner rather than later, and the work that we will be doing to meet the objectives of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages by 2032. With that, I thank you.
Enkosi kakhulu Mr. Landschuls, siyathembisa kakhulu, sivuya nakanjalo into kubana sinayo inkxaso ka PanSALB sizezilwimi zesintu, African languages, kwaye siyathembisa into kuba asikho apha ukuzokwenza ingxaki kuphela to create problems, but into ezakwenzeka we will come up with a solution and resolution. Enkosi tata, thank you so much. Okulandelayo ngoku is the introduction of the keynote speaker by who? Prof. Linda Kwacha. It gives me pleasure to introduce Unjingalwazi Liketi Makalela. Njingalwazi Liketi Makalela is a full professor and founding director of the Hub for Multilingual Education and Literacy at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa. He is a distinguished visiting professor at City University of New York. His research areas include translanguaging, multilingual education, and literacies. He is a B-rated researcher and a holder of the National Research Foundation Saatchi Chair on Advancing African Languages for Social Inclusion and Access. He pioneered a globally acclaimed theoretical model, Ubuntu Translanguaging, and its pedagogical equivalent. Ubuntu Translanguaging pedagogy to normalize simultaneous learning and teaching in more than one language in complex multilingual education systems. His highly influential book is Shifting Lenses, Multilanguaging, Decolonization, and Education in the Global South. His recent books are Decolonizing Multilingual in Africa, Recentering Silent Voices from the Global South with Phoenix Ndlovu, Rethinking Language Use in Digital Africa, Technology and Communication in Sub-Saharan Africa with Judith White. Not 11 Languages, Translanguaging and South African Multilingualism in Concert, and language and institutional identity in the post-apartheid South African higher education perspective on policy and practice. Lowo ke ngunjingalwazi Liketi Makalela. Over to you. Njingalwazi.
Habari za Molo Nda Abusheni Realocha Tobela Dumelang Sawubona. Kitabile today, Njabulile to be here. I'm truly excited about this amazing opportunity. This 1 hour granted to me by the ALASA executive and the organizing committee and the trust bestowed in me. I don't take it for granted because this is an hour that I'll never ever have again in my lifetime. So it is this hour, and the CEO, program director, thank you so much for that glowing introduction. You also put the CEO before me, which is very difficult after you put the academic after the CEO. But what he said to us is quite pointed, that time is now, and then the conferences should not just be academic exercises that do not have relevance out there. I want to acknowledge the dignitaries from DAC, PanSALB, led by the CEO, University of KwaZulu-Natal, Professor, the DVC was with us yesterday, and the ALASA executive in general, my colleagues and friends from here and Ayonda. Kaleboga for this opportunity. What I would like to do today is to use this hour and truly being humbled by this opportunity. And as I say, it's not happening frequently. I was chosen among a number of academics that are very brilliant and could have given you a different keynote address. So what I'm doing with you, first to introduce myself, Ligeti Makalela Kamasinga, right? So Svadluli Spangaskali, okay? That is the fullness of me, okay? And I also have the privilege, I've been in ALASA, but I also was out of ALASA for some time. And I know why, but I'm a prodigal son because after yesterday's welcoming reception, the warmth of the colleagues here, including the Durban weather, the place everybody should run to, I found a reason why I went out of this family. It's because my direction became more in the education space, language and literacy education. And as we'll be talking with the ALASA executive to infuse that for us to come back into ALASA, we need to see African languages in education more and more, even in the programming. I just thought I should highlight that. What we are doing here is to talk about, if the CEO probably would have this, which is if you have got multiple things that you need to do, but you have limited resources, you go for the least difficult, but the one that would give you the biggest results. And that's called efficiency. That's why we talk about the bull's eye. Not the whole bull, we're interested in the eye, because that's the whole thing about you want to really have a grip on that. So in this space, then we reimagine African languages in education for a transformative future. And I will share with you some of the developments. The CEO already cited Alexander, Neville Alexander, which means I'm good CEO at reading your mind. And then the question is, na molatu kwa kgomo goba molatu kwa, whose problem is that? Badishi ba itlogetse ya mporogohlong wa dithaba, in the dungeon where you cannot actually reach it. Okay? This is from OK Matsepe, the classic in African, in Sepedi or Sesotho sa Leboa literature. This is the challenge that we have, which is, so is the South African language story of our lives. It is an amazing fact that South Africa, in spite of its modernist pretensions, is one of the few countries worldwide where at least primary school children are not taught through the medium of the mother tongue or a language of immediate community, and this is very key. It does not necessarily mean your mother's tongue in that traditional sense. It is an equally amazing fact that within the South African context, the only children who receive mother tongue medium education virtually from cradle to the tertiary level are the minority English and Afrikaans speaking children of the country. Children born to parents whose home language is one or other African language. That is, the vast majority of our children are doomed, underline, to be taught through the medium of the second language, mostly English, from the third or fourth year of school, mostly by teachers for whom this medium is at best a second language, but often only a third language. I have a Norwegian friend, Birgit Brock Utne. We say, what is the African problem? He says it is stupification. And literally what that means is that children don't understand what the teachers are saying. And equally, the teachers don't deeply understand what they're saying. So if you put that together, you have what is called either stupification or de-education. Because we cannot be serious and talk about sustainable development, epistemic access, if you don't understand what the teacher is saying, and the teacher doesn't fully understand what he is or she is saying. Molaotheo wa Maleme-thutong, the Language in Education Policy of 1997. Sometimes we have got great policies that are out there, but if we don't really sink deeper into that, they become actually a burden to the same challenge that is trying to resolve. This is what it says: subject to any law dealing with language in education and the constitutional rights of the learners. In determining the language policy of the school, the governing body must stipulate how the school will promote multilingualism through, underline, using more than one language of learning and teaching. And then it gives the caveat, and/or applying special immersion or language maintenance programs. Very beautiful policy, very generic, but it's not specific enough. Especially if you say immersion programs, which means you can have an immersion program, which is you start with an African language, and then you can immerse the kids into the language of wider communication. It allows for that. And our maintenance, that's what we call subtractive bilingualism. Basically, subtractive bilingualism is promoted, even with this policy. On the other hand, you have got maintenance program where you can maintain both the African language and English over time. We don't see that happening after grade 4. Since the 1800s, by the way, by the missionary educationists, 30 years into democracy. Which is why every school that you go, they will have this. It changed nothing because you satisfy the policy requirements. It says use more than one language. In fact, that's why then we talk about trans-languaging, because there is a space for that. It allows for that, but at the same time, the policy, the implementers don't think that is the right thing to do when it's actually in the policy. So you have and you don't have at the same time. So then you'd have what is called covert policy. This is explicit, but the actual one is the one that is not written here, which is become monolingual. It is in this spirit that Finex Ndlovu and I began to question what we mean multilingualism. Let's decolonize. Everybody say multilingualism is assumed to be, okay, that's the African way of thinking about our languages. We could be putting the same concept of multi-conceived in the global south and planting it here. And that is why our multilingualisms may not work. So is there anything called African multilingualism? I'm going to tap into the previous keynote speaker yesterday, a speaker on the historicized or historicization of our languages in this year. And the theme of this conference is about, if we decolonize multilingualism, the next thing, of course, the role of technology and African languages in this, what the CEO, PanSALB CEO mentioned. We need to rethink the use of African languages in digital spaces. I do know that here this is a tough war in African languages. We're in the process where we're thinking language decay or language progress, right? Which is an old debate in the 1700s when we say we need to keep and preserve the language for what it is, or we allow it to progress because it has to evolve as human beings do. So unfortunately, somehow we are still trapped, and there's ambivalence around what technology can do to African languages. I think there's hope in that. The DHET, Prof. Halakhala is here, and the Western Cape, University of Western Cape, have received a DHET grant to support universities in South Africa to promote multilingualism. As I speak, about 70-something million rands went to universities split into, of course, smaller units of 2 million each. What that tries to do is to change the academic landscape where African languages can be languages of learning, teaching, researching, and assessing. And then we have got, the challenge is that you have got education linguists or applied language studies in education, and we have got linguistics, African languages, which is not connected to educational matters. So a very good divide and conquer. In the end, you don't actually have anything. So what we have in this book is the policies that we have at our universities are conceived monolingually, even though they masquerade as multilingual university. Because if languages are going to be thought about as sealed in boxes, hermetically sealed, unrelated to each other, then that is a monolingual multilingualism. It's not the true horizontal version that I'm going to talk about earlier on, which I truly think that's the African multilingualism. That is why today it has been very, very difficult, and I'm going to ask the academics here, how come you can be in an African university, do law, do BCom, do medicine, and any degree that you can imagine, and exit that university without having learned an African language? That's an abnormality that has been normalized. Very abnormal. In fact, you don't go anywhere in the world. You go to Germany, for the first 6 months you must learn German. You go to any part of the world, if you're going to ever study there, you have to learn an African language. Just imagine the power of that. If every university can say, you can't graduate without having learned an African language. We don't need to theorize and talk about prestige planning and all of that, because that's prestigious already. We are preparing our graduates so that they can serve the communities that we have. And we are there in African languages departments. Clearly. We are silent about this. And I can understand, because the pressures of wanting to be promoted from being an associate lecturer to junior lecturer, senior lecturer, you are really thinking about your career in that particular way. But as the CEO said, if from this conference can come up with a resolution that we want our South African universities to endorse this as a national principle, that no one 3 years from now can graduate at a South African university without having learned an African language. If we are going to pick at, the CEO spoke about actual actionables. We can move from here with our placards and go to the nearest government office and say, this is the ALASA resolution, peaceful demonstration. Because we should be exhausted about writing about the books in the article, and then that paper is going to be read by 15 people if you are lucky, and then you become promoted, but there's nothing that we can do about that, very little. ALASA, and in fact, I'm very proud, well-attended conference. You are the hope for this nation. It is in this spirit also that we accepted that we have 11 official languages. Of course, Nhlapo and Neville Alexander and many others have told us long time ago that we have accepted that we are different when we are not materially different. Apart from the high degree of mutual intelligibility within the Sotho languages, as I was saying, Dumelang, and then everybody was confused whether it's Setswana or Sepedi or yes, because it's one language. Just varieties of the same thing, which you can put together in one orthography, written form. I dare say equally the same is true for the Nguni languages to a very large extent. There will be 20% of difference, which is acceptable in terms of the vocabulary at lexical level, at phonological level. We don't count those as material differences. The differences are in the morphological, syntactical configuration of a language. Then you can say we have different languages. But what does this mean when you say we don't have 11 official languages? Just to challenge the status quo to say, we could be thinking about overlaps, especially with what you call trans-languaging today, that in the same class, if you learn, look at I want to refer you also to the school act about languages. So we have adopted actually bilingual, not multilingual, language in education policy. If you are Mupedi, you can only learn Sepedi and English at school. There's no provision for you to learn a language from the other group. Let's say you learn Nguni language. And if you are from KZN, an option for you or prescription for you to learn a Sotho language. So we are basically still in a linguistic apartheid where we are so much divided. It's just, you can only read in your mother tongue, and yet we can speak all these multiple languages. How is that? That's not normal. When we say we move from the bilingualism of apartheid, we come to the democracy in 1994, but you can still only read. And then if you think about that, Bantu education was created in order to precisely do that, to divide and conquer, so that there's no cross-pollination among African languages. Okay? There was a professor, a gentleman yesterday, who kept saying when he meets me, says, oh, you say individual multilingualism. In other words, you have got, yes, we have many languages here, but that's not really multilingualism. Because this type of has not looked at, is a societal multilingualism and not individual multilingualism. In other words, how, as a person, how many languages I speak and I use, rather than how many languages out there that we can count in the society. So there's a difference. Okay? So let's begin. Prof, yesterday you spoke about history and you reminded us about Timbuktu and our historical consciousness. How did we come to think that we are different? Here, a British historian called Trevor Roper in 1963, when he reflected on Africans' history. He said, perhaps in the future there will be some African history, but at present there is none. There's only the history of Europeans in Africa. And what that means, even today, the concept of multilingualism still becoming a European conceived concept. People without history culture become mimics who have placed their memories in psychic tomb. That's Ngukuwa Tuyongo. And the Ruel Khosa reminds us we have to meet prevailing global challenges from within our own worldview and proceed to action from our own authentic possibilities based on the culture and competencies of the Africans themselves. By this, it means our ways of being, our ways of knowing, our ways of acting should be in and through what we know, which is our mother tongues. We call this mother tongue. Dr. Mbude speaks about if you say mother tongue, because there's a, is that the mother tongue? It means for the first sound that you hear as a child in your mother's womb, that's the voice of your mother. That's how it's called a mother tongue. Right? But we know that it's a placeholder for so many people. It's not necessarily the case that after you have heard that, you continue with that. Epistemological, ontological, methodological, that's what we are talking about. They should be framed from the IKS. I saw Professor, the Dean of Education from UFS, about the indigenous knowledge system. I had the privilege, my colleagues, to stay in New York for a little bit, and I live in Johannesburg. In New York, you have got, that's the biggest city in the world, with the largest population on planet Earth. Therefore, it has got almost all languages that are spoken on this planet, little rock called Earth. You'd find them in New York. And then I also live in Johannesburg, which is the biggest city on the African continent. And then it has got, it's a melting pot for literally everybody. If you go to small street, you literally have everybody on the African continent speaking different languages. But in South Africa, everybody from all the 9 provinces, I can think about that. What you see in New York, however, you hear all these languages. Somebody's on the phone, they have got their earphones, and they're speaking with each other. But it's a Spanish person speaking to another Spanish person. It's an Arabic person speaking to another Arabic person. It's an English person speaking to another English-speaking person. English to English, Arabic to Arabic. So it is a parallel. Okay, what's the mathematical word? It's a vertical type of multilingualism, because these languages coexist, but they are not necessarily overlapping. Now go to Soweto, or just watch The Generations, or Muvango, or anything. I don't know what you are saying, because when we enjoy so. That's what you hear ordinarily in the street. So you have you have got languages that are flowing into each other. And that type of multilingualism is what we'll define as horizontal. So the nice thing about Johannesburg is that you'll have both horizontal and vertical in one space. In fact, that becoming the future, where I think, so when we talk about multilingualism and defining conceptually, we should be thinking about that at an individual level, not what exists out there. And I want to remind us that there's a big colonial hangover. How do we hang to what we have? I want to flip back to education. The need to transition the local people into Western cultural values necessitated an adoption of European monolingual practices from the missionary schools. The language policies were reinforced later through the recommendations of the Felstoke Commission of the 1920s. This is what it says. And compare with Trevor Roper, the tribal language should be used in the lower elementary standards or grades. That's a colonial prescription. Number 2, a lingua franca of African origin should be introduced in the middle classes of the school if the area is occupied by large native groups speaking diverse languages. At least we don't have that in South Africa. But bullet 3, the language of the European nation in control. That is Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone. But that's not even true. Actually, it's Afrophone, because the many languages that you hear in Africa are actual African languages and not necessarily those. So conceptually, we are made to accept this is a Lusophone. It simply means it should be taught in the upper standards. Is that not the case in 2024? And that we have to convince an African that it's okay to learn through your mother tongue from grade 4. Hey, the parents will not accept that. It's something that had been injected into the minds. Because of this, the Department of Basic Education, there was a beam of light, okay? And I happened to be the technical advisor for language and literacy tasked to run what is called a national rapid assessment study. Rapid in this sense means a state is the type of research you do in the state of emergency. Okay? Also, the DBE, thanks to the PanSALB push for public entities to establish language units. So the DBE sought to establish a national language unit to comply with the provisions of both the Constitutional Act and the Use of Official Languages Act 12 of 2012. And these provisions were to review the language in education policy and ensure that each school operates within the prescripts of the policy frameworks that promotes multilingualism. But as I said, which multilingualism? Number 2, ensure that African languages are advanced to the level of usage as languages of learning and teaching beyond grade 3. We want to do this in 2025 because since the 1800s, that had been the case, colonially ingrained. So what we do, we use the same thing that we all know as linguists, language policy and planning development or implementation framework. But the challenge with this is that it has got this hierarchical trap. We think that if you say status planning, then you must follow corpus planning, complete the corpus, and then you have the acquisition planning, and then the prestige planning. These are simply concepts, but they should not be interpreted in a linear, sequential order. Otherwise, you'll never get to the destination. That is why then we need to fix the planes while they're in the air, instead of waiting for a terminal end. You'll never have an African language that is developed before you use it. In fact, you have to use it in order for it to develop, not the other way around. That's why the method that we use is called effective implementational hybrid design. While you are implementing, you are busy collecting evidence of good practices and improving as you go. We don't need to be perfectionists. Otherwise, we become analysis paralysis, right? We analyze until we are paralyzed, that we don't move. You know, the lexicography, we have to have the lexicography, we have to change that until nothing actually happens. We have to move. The CEO has said that. And then when we do this type of research too, we need to decolonize research as well. You don't just research on the communities, but you research with them. You respect them. They are very intelligent people that must give you information, especially if you talk about the colonial. If you take a questionnaire in English, you go to Soweto, say, in which language do you want your child to learn? Obvious. Is that the research question? You haven't even started because the answer is obvious. You are simply going to glorify the status quo. So we need to think way beyond and not think that even the parents are neutral or they know what they don't know. Okay, so in this case, we did something slightly different by going even to the traditional leaders, faith-based leaders, counselors, parents, SGBs, teachers, learners, and principal. And you ask the traditional healer, does it make sense is it a good practice that your child must move? Is it something spiritual about that at grade 4? No. Okay, pastor, does it make sense in God's sense that the children must be cut off their language from grade 4? No. Okay, counselor, does it make political sense for Africans to be immersed into an English language in grade 4? No. Culturalists and indeed IKS practitioners, is there anything making sense out of this? No. Linguists, does it make sense in terms of language acquisition that before you are 6 years, it takes you 6 years to become a fully fledged mother tongue speaker of your language? But does it make sense when you learn a language that is not your mother tongue to be short-circuited in 3 years and be expected? No. Then it doesn't make sense at all. It doesn't make linguistic, cultural, spiritual, religious, and sense. There's no sense at all, but it's a practice that we continue with, and we have been continuing with for so many years when it doesn't make sense. How can we explain that? The Eastern Cape has given a limelight because for 10 years, when this idea was thought through, they went actually without support, and thanks to PanSALB and other organizations that saw a platform in there, and we went into the Eastern Cape to detail. It was not even necessary to test whether learning in your mother tongue makes sense or not sense. But we wanted to give confidence to the nation if we can use the Eastern Cape as a prototype for implementation throughout all of South Africa. Yes, I'll share with you the results very quickly. Here are some of the results. I'm going to try to go quicker, Program Chair. One, desirability, the support for African languages as languages of learning, teaching beyond grade 3 has got that overwhelming support from the grassroots level. But of course, if you ask just the teacher and the circuit manager and a middle-class parent, they'll say no. Overwhelmingly, from our survey, people feel that this is the way to go. Of course, they caution the practicability, as the Constitution also says. Transition to English in grade 4 is premature and is disruptive. This, if you compare international literature on grade 4, what they call grade 4 slum, and the Matthew effect, which means the weaker are getting weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker over time. How do we know that in South Africa? Grade 12. They have sunk so deep and weaker. Now what we need to do, we need to resuscitate the dead. How do we do that? Camps. No Sunday, no Saturday, no church, no soccer, no play, nothing. You are being grilled so that you can pass that matric. And the irony of that is billions and billions of money are going into the system. The second irony is that you are subjecting these kids to the lowest level of human cognition. It's called memory, memorization. And then the teachers are becoming the cooks, the securities, the social workers, the lawyer, the everything in there, untrained to run that task at all. By the way, where are the unions? At no pay. You do it. And then we receive them at universities. They are used to you giving them that type of intensive attention. We don't. Because of that, the dropout rate, very big. Okay, the trans-languaging, what teachers call code switching, they say this is the only way in all the provinces of South Africa, in all public schools, including most of the private schools, that code switching, using more than one language when you teach photosynthesis, is a normal. So anybody who says something else, they come from a different planet, not our South African schools. Okay? Except that is not matched by assessments, regimes, and the problem there is that the teachers are afraid of the circuit manager. And the circuit manager says, you can't use it. And then we check with the circuit manager, why can't they use it? No, it's not according to policy. Okay, circuit manager, you can go to the district. District, is there any reason why they can't use this? Oh yeah, no, it's just a practice, we don't do that. Okay, let's go to the police. Is there anything the police that say they can't? There's nothing. Because if anything, remember the language in education policy says use more than one language, using more than one language for learning and teaching. But the interpretation is not in the same lesson. But we are using the same document. So actually to say that teachers should not code switch is what is against the policy. Okay? And we have seen a small number of schools piloting with straight for English medium, focusing on English proficiency, and which is misguided really. Having learned from other African countries, we know that that doesn't work. English barrier to learning, yet there are myths that overstate the importance of English as a language of learning and teaching. Here is a big myth. English is an international language, yes. It is an international language of what? Of communication. But is it an international language of learning and teaching? No. Because all countries that we know outside of Africa, except India that goes up to grade 7, they use their own languages for learning and teaching, but they learn English as a subject. There's a difference, and this is the difference that many South Africans never get to understand. And the parents are misinformed. It's a language of job. English, yes, is it a language of job? Not quite true, actually. We should not be having unemployment rate that we have, if that was the case. And also when you tell people, kids in primary before they're 16, you say, this is a language of job. They don't need jobs. They need to learn. And they can only think about jobs when they're maybe after 16 years, 17, 18, at that level. But primary school, there's no job for you as a kid. So it's a misnomer, commodification of a language, even planted to the lowest space where you don't really need it. And it's not a language of jobs because other people know other languages, Africans in South Africa, right? They learn through the medium of Afrikaans, they have jobs. In fact, not only jobs, but the whole entrepreneur space in a language that is not English. And yet they can speak English as a language of communication, but they don't use English for learning and teaching. So that's why we need ALASA. I'll skip this finding so that I go to the next piece, which is very brief on the literacy. That's why then we came up with these recommendations that from 2025, African languages should be used as LOLT. We should move in that direction. We normalize trans-languaging as a key methodology for using more than one language in the same lesson, not in the same school, but same lesson when you teach photosynthesis is normal. Refine terminology because frames such as mother tongue, additional language can be very challenging in complex spaces such as Johannesburg. It's not your mother tongue, it's a language of immediate community. Minimum threshold for mother tongue-based Bilingual education is 7 years of schooling, and then advocacy training of the teachers. And this is the first bull's eye, okay? So if you normalize trans-languaging as a pedagogy, which will explain what that means, and this is an epistemic makeshift, because it's a low-hanging fruit. Teachers are already doing it. It's just not formalized, so you don't need so many materials in terms of the pedagogy. It offers gradual release of English as the only language of learning and teaching. It smoothens transition at key points when necessary and to higher education. It aligns teaching and assessment of and for learning. And the literature converges that I haven't read anything that say trans-languaging is a bad practice for learning and teaching. It's a catalyst for mother tongue-based bilingual education where you have English and an African language used simultaneously for learning and teaching in spaces where African languages are not used at all. I know that's where the controversy comes in. And then it releases the teachers skilled of smuggling to becoming a creative innovator. When you know that you are smuggling languages in the classroom, there's no way that you can be creative and imaginative. You are basically a thief. Well, what is trans-languaging and where does it, is it another European concept that we just plant in our African concept? My esteemed Ghanaian colleague, the Sankofa, going back to fetch, we can learn, as you said, Prof, about historicization. If you go back before colonization, that's when you see the value of this translingualism as a norm. And then what you find that once upon a time, we don't even need to go to Timbuktu or to the Kemites in Egypt, Egyptos. We need to go just a few kilometers outside of down in Limpopo at the Sache, the melting of the Sache River and Limpopo, the border of Zimbabwe, and Botswana and South Africa. There, you know, there were cousins and brothers, under the whole Emperor Monomotapa. That's our history. They were able to create even rhino made of gold. And they were using more than one language. Even if you go down to Mapungwe today, you look at the ceramic pots, you'll see that the Ngunis, the Sotos, the Karangas, and everybody were actually there. In Limpopo, actually have got people called Bagoni. They are actually related to the Ngunis and vice versa, right? So, and at the mountain, we had the Mapunguwe, and then in African language, we have these sayings, which means visitor come to me so that I'm complete. It doesn't mean eating. That's why we say, I am, because you are. I'm incomplete without you. So I start from the communal and I become the individual in the midst of being the community. I only see myself all the time in the context of other people. That's my lens. And compare this with the Romans. I am, therefore, I think, therefore, I am. That's the meanness, I, me, and myself, which is very individualistic. I don't want to be extreme on both ends because these overlap, but I wanted to make the point about this type, the king living at this mountain, and you have all these people in the gathering having the Limpopo River flourishing, very wealthy, and using more than one language. So trans-languaging had been there as a cultural competence of the Africans. It's not a St. William's work in the 1980s. Because of this, then we leverage on what we have. We say the confluence Ubuntu, confluence and infinite relations of dependency, even to localize and make sure that we are sure about it. We named it as Ubuntu translanguaging. Okay, with all of that, I wouldn't go into the details now because I have a quick story before in the next 10 minutes, my last 10 minutes. Which is this? Okay, a different cap now. Program director, this is the last piece of my talk, and this is what has gotten the nation talking. That South African children are not able to read for meaning in any language, but what that means, these are African-speaking children, and when they say any language, they really mean African languages. 81% of them. And if you compare the result, you'll see that it has been going on for some time, over time, hugely over time. So as a national outcry, even in the presidential SONA 4 years ago or so, that we need South African children to read for meaning by the age of 10. That is almost in everybody's tongues right now. And if you think about so even here then we had to do a deep dive into the system. And you look at since 2019 to 2023, billions and billions of money invested in literacy in South Africa. South Africa spends, I think, far much more money than any other country on the continent, and many other countries even in the developed world, if you go by percentage. And also donor funds from the USAID and UNICEF and everybody wants to fund reading in this country. These are some of the reading champions. If you are in the village, you'll hear there's a champion for reading. And there's a Read to Learn campaign. There's a EGRA tests that come from the US. There's a reading benchmarks in 10. They speak about African languages, but we don't really hear ALASA members commenting about things such as that. I'm just going to skip that and go to the next one. Despite all these monies, billions, maybe a little bit more, probably that's the biggest pot of funds that get to waste. Persistent Matthew effect. The weaker are getting weaker over time. When they start from grade 1, they're a little bit smarter, and then they go down, and then in grade 4, they get even weaker. And then the Matthew effect, the weaker get weaker and weaker and weaker, and the pass rate at grade 12, of course, we have to resuscitate and all of that, despite the money that goes into that, okay? So that's why then we designed the vision for inclusive, holistic, comprehensive literacy approach in line with the 2030 National Development Plan. Maybe we need a 2060 national plan after this one because it's only 5 years to get there. We are not close. Why don't we achieve this? Because the initial teacher education, the B.Ed programs in our universities are supplying teachers that are not trained, are not taught through the medium of African languages, and they're expected to go teach in schools using African languages. So you haven't been taught how to teach in African language, but you're going to school to teach. That's another huge abnormality. Therefore, the teachers produced are not fit for purpose. But heavily outside of that, there's this consistent monolingual epistemic biases that overlooks the difference between English and African languages by misapplying the logic of English into reading packages of African languages. How do we know this? Backing a text. Moto otlile sikolong sa re na ada umuntu uhambile. That's why. Go to every primary school in South Africa and just walk through as if you're going to see the teacher. You'll hear. That's called reading, backing a text. And the teachers are doing that, preaching in the desert, in the hopes that they will be live in the desert. Because we have coined a World War I in reading literacy called the phonics. Well, as linguists here, you are going to guide us. In fact, CEO is one of the resolves that we're tapping into the wisdom of African language specialists to guide. Phonics approach, early readers learn to decode words by sounding out each letter or group of letters. That is universal. I think you need to compare the sounds to the letter somehow, sound letter mapping, okay? Thank you, Chair. I'll be quick. We think this works relatively, if it's overdone in African languages, while it works relatively well for English, but not so well in African languages of Bantu origin. How do we know? Because the phonics approach, as it states, is predicated on the logic of West Germanic languages. How do we know? There is phonemic and orthographic differences between English and the languages of African origin, of Bantu origin. We say African languages are transparent orthographically, whereas English is opaque. In other words, you have sight words in English. A sound for G can be gel in one context, in another one can be girl. And then if you look at the using plural, using the S, T, S, S, that's what the child sees. But if you have got stops, such as T, as in cats, but if you have voiced stops, as in G, then it becomes dogs. And then if you have vowels, words ending with vowel like horse, it becomes horses, right? So you have the same letters is realized phonemically differently in English. Now, what is the strategy then, the logic in English? The only way to teach this is to make a lot of noise until the children figure it out, because you can't explain that complexity. But that logic, unfortunately, is used in African languages that don't necessarily need, because what you see in isiZulu is what you get. Sa, wu, wona. You only have 5 vowels, a, e, o, u, period. And not diphthongs and I have my esteemed linguist at the back, the diphthongs and many other configurations in there. There's also something called syllabic integrity. The last 5 minutes, I'll really skip to the end, Program Chair, but this is fascinating. I thought I should share. African languages of Bantu family are primarily syllabic. So in a sound such as Sepedi, for example, you have even a word for no is awa. So you already have 3 syllables there. So they are syllabically very rich, which means they love vowels. Right? Even when you speak English, you say condition. We still want to put the vowel at the end. We love the vowels. So that's how we know. This is, speaker spoke about African English. Okay? Whereas in English prefers monosyllabic words. I mean, the majority of words, love, jump, eat, run, anything, those are monosyllabic words. So in the logic of English, then we say we start with monosyllabic words. We have to emphasize that. But you don't necessarily need the same in the package of African languages, because you are very polysyllabic. So because of this, the missionary linguists came up with a methodology called Ba-Be-Bi-Bo-Wu. The Ba-Be-Bi-Bo-Wu methodology, which is predicated on trying to chase a syllable. You just combine a consonant and a vowel. As long as there's a vowel and a consonant, That's a syllable. That's how we start reading, even though it doesn't make sense. I wonder how many words you have in isiZulu that are monosyllabic. Or in Sepedi, a word starting with su. In Soto language is su. Very rare. But the children have to sing this all the time. Anyway, the one, World War II, whole language approach, here it does work relatively for African languages, but not so well for English. That's why it became wars. So it became a problem to do whole language in English when the orthography is not transparent. But you have got cognitive overload if you take that siyabonga, which is one word, but actually it's a sentence, right? Peaceful war, because neither of these work, then let's go to a balanced approach, which is just a misnomer. This, the default is that it needs a teacher who is very much trained to balance the two. But the default, we go to phonics, because it's okay to say V and R. World War IV, which is where the story is at the moment, what we call the science of reading. If you look at that, it's still heavily biased because it starts with phonics, phonological awareness, vocabulary fluency, and you are counting word per minute, the speed, at the assumption that if you read faster, then you understand. Whereas in isiZulu, the slower you speak, the more measured you are, allowing all your vowels to be inside of you, and that's how you are so respected in that language, not speed. That's the logic of English. And then that creates cognitive overload. As a result, the kids don't really understand. So all of this then don't really work. What we need to do then is to have a multilingual approach that leverages on differences, linguistic typology, as strength in literacy packaging. So we call this mother tongue-based reading literacy approach, and this is the second bull's eye. So to ALASA and colleagues, we think that if we take a morphological awareness-centered approach to reading literacy, that will be a huge entry point into making African children to read for meaning in African languages. In other words, instead of phonemic awareness, we emphasize morphological awareness. And I'll demonstrate why. I'll skip the theoretical part for that, but just go hear what Dr. Chokwe is here. He taught me this piece. In African languages have got noun class prefix systems that are so regulated and regular. Even though I didn't know, right? So we are not saying don't have phonics, but the teaching of the sounds must be embedded with morphological awareness as a big umbrella. In the sense that if you say m and o is a consonant and a vowel, but it makes sense because it's already saying people in the singular. And if you say va, it is people in the plural, so we know that. So you can do the v and the r and make songs about this, but you start from day one that it is embedded in meaning from the word go, instead of sounds that are random. This is the morphological awareness approach that we are. Lesson 1, just the last minute. Introduce learners, just in a lesson plan, what this would look like as a teacher. That's what I want to get down to that. What does it mean? Introduce learners to singular and plural concept using prefixes mo and ba. Material, picture, cars, a person, moto, people, batho, simple song, and matching games. Activities, first 10 minutes, introduction with a song. Use simple song or chant that includes words with more or ba, emphasizing the change in number. Okay? They are learning matching letter and sounds, but it's already embedded in the context that is morphologically rich. Okay, I'll skip all of that and then go to the last points. that we want to bring this up into what we call the National Literacy Operation Framework to say the only way that we can make children in African languages to read for meaning is to infuse morphological awareness into the literacy packaging. In other words, you have a curriculum that is English, and then you have a different curriculum that is African language when it comes to reading. Don't version. We call this severing the umbilical cord. Number one, the big takeaways in my talk, one are translanguaging to enact multilingual teaching using African languages for learning and teaching beyond grade 3, is opportune to do live corpus and acquisition planning as well as prestige, because African language would move gradually into the stage that we expect them to be, but they have to leverage on English because English itself leverages on other languages, right? It borrowed 80% of words in English are not English, okay? And it's okay for African languages to borrow. Morphological awareness for African languages of bound into the current reading packages and improve our learning outcomes. Empower lecturers to adapt indigenous pedagogies in teaching and through African languages. And the last one, which is a request to ALASA, or the curriculum for African language, they have things like sight words and things that don't exist in African languages. The teachers are teaching what should not actually be there based on the African languages logic. Literacy and language education to form part of ALASA's organizing principles and members to be involved in education matters. If we can bridge that gap, I think we have got a long way to go. To my beloved ALASA, let us go to the moon. We go to the moon not because it is easy to do so, but we go to the moon because it is desirable. So we do what we have to do when we have to do it, even when we don't feel like it, as long as we have got the desire. Let us go to the moon. Thank you.
Enkosi kakhulu Prof. Ngoku ndizawubiza ngaphambili unjingalwazi uZulu ukuthi asinike ke ngoku into yoba kuza kwenzeka ntoni ukusukela ngoku. Enkosi kakhulu.